So if you watched my introductory video, one of the things that you will notice is that I sort of said that sociology is a way of seeing the world. And that's sort of true, but in some ways it's also not very true, because sociology is not a way of seeing the world. It's a collection of a bunch of them. And that's one of the challenges that I find students often have when we start talking about theory, because in sort of most students' experience up to this point, we're dealing with theory in sort of a scientific sense in sort of the natural sciences. So if you took, say, a physics class, they teach you that we used to think the atom looked like this, and then we realized we were wrong, and so we replaced that theory with this one. And we used to think it looked like this, but we're wrong, so we replaced it with this one. And in sort of physics, they only really use the latest and most accurate theory in that sort of conversation. We do the same thing in biology, we do the same thing in chemistry. Sociology is a little bit different in that sociology, and you'll see this in your textbook chapter throughout the whole sort of course, one of the things that happens in sociology is that we've got multiple theories and multiple approaches to the way that the world works. And that is a challenge. I often get students asking me which one is the right one, and the answer is none of them, all of them. It depends on the question you're asking. So we're going to talk a little bit about individual theories. Your book covers sort of 5 broad categories of theory. There are some others, but we're not going to worry about them for right now. So 5 sort of theories, and the reality is that sociologists use all of them. We use them for different questions, we use them in different contexts. You'll definitely find sociologists who prefer one over the other. That's completely normal. You'll probably find that 1 or 2 of them make a lot more sense to you than the other ones do, and that's also fine. For my purposes, what I need you to be able to do is to understand them, not necessarily to like them, I think is maybe the way to put it. So we're going to start with the sort of 2 micro-macro distinctions, and there's really 2, sometimes 3. We'll start with 2, then we'll get into feminism. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but there's really 2 macro level theories that sort of assume that the way that society affects the individual is that society exists as a structure and the individual is influenced by that. Okay, so this is those 2 are very top-down models in that the structure is actually more important than the individual. And those 2 theories are structural functionalism, depending on where you want to sort of look at that, and conflict theory, which is sort of the broad term for the approaches to society developed by Marx and those who sort of followed him. Oh, there's my cat. Welcome to online classes. So we're going to talk a little bit about functionalism and then conflict theory, and we'll sort of talk about why they are similar and how they are different. So for functionalists, the central idea about understanding society is that that everything in society has a function, and all of those pieces work together to create the social structure that we have. This is a really strong focus on the idea of harmony, and it's sort of an assumption that everyone in society agrees as to what society should look like, what the benefits are going to be. And that's very useful if what you're interested in is how people cooperate, and it can be a real challenge because there are also times when people don't cooperate, and functionalism isn't very well set up to deal with that. So one of the criticisms of functionalism, such as it is that it tends to be a very conservative theory. And what I mean by that is not sort of a political thing. I just mean that functionalists tend to assume that whatever we have, we need. And that's fine when we start talking about, well, we need families to socialize children, and that sort of seems okay. But when functionalists say everything has a function, they really mean everything. And that means that functionalists occasionally wind up in the position of sort of saying, well, if we have slavery, then slavery is necessary to society. Slavery serves some kind of positive function. And that is a position that many people in a contemporary society may not be okay with. it is possible to articulate a function for racism, and there are functionalists who do so, but most people are not comfortable with the idea that racism is a necessary part of society, and therefore we shouldn't disrupt it, because disrupting it will sort of cause instability in society. And that's sort of really what we mean when we talk about functionalism as a conservative theory, because it doesn't tend to emphasize the value of change. It sort of comes from this place where everything we have we need, so we kind of need to protect the status quo. Okay? So that's functionalism. It is one of our sort of big macro level theories. The other is sort of conflict theory. As I said, this draws on Marx, although there are lots of other people who work in the same vein. But they sort of take the opposite position, right? Rather than assuming that everyone in society agrees what society needs to look like, conflict theorists start from the presumption that at its core, fundamentally, society is people struggling over scarce resources and power. Okay, so there's a conversation there about what we need, and that people are trying to jostle and climb a hierarchy so that they will have power over other people. For Marx and his contemporaries and sort of people working in that tradition, that tension is usually around, the formal term is the relationship to the means of production. For our purposes, you might as well simplify that and say it's about money. So for sort of a lot of Marxist and conflict theorists, as we understand it sort of classically, this is really about the people who have money, resources, power, and the people who don't. For Marx, this is about the people who own the factories and the people who work in them. People who have sort of worked in a post-industrial society have sort of come up with some different ideas that we'll get into in terms of ideology and power and that sort of thing. So this is a very useful theory if what you're interested in is those tensions, but in some ways it's like the opposite of functionalism, because it misses that idea that there are some times and some places, at least in society, where we actually see much more cooperation than conflict. So a really contemporary example of that might be the people who are arguing that climate change, for example, is not a class-based issue, that everyone needs to deal with climate change because if the world becomes unlivable, it's actually bad for everyone. Rich, poor, doesn't matter. Everyone's going to suffer, so this becomes sort of an issue that crosses that. A more contemporary, or like a more classical and sort of more easier to digest example, because climate change can be contentious, is something like norms and rules that prohibit murder. So when we talk about murder, generally, it would be very difficult to argue that it's good for the wealthy in society to be protected from murder, but that people who have less resources don't have a similar interest in being protected from sort of violence and that sort of thing. We can definitely talk about whether they actually are and sort of the way the resources are spent, but the interest is the same if we're going to sort of assume that sort of interest in life. Okay, so that's sort of part of the challenge, and that is, conflict theory is also based on an idea that fundamentally there isn't enough resources in our societies to satisfy everyone. You may or may not think that that's true, but that's sort of where the belief structure comes from. Okay?